The class learned Earth was defeated. Then she asked if the instructor had read the last page. The holographic board behind me was already lit when I walked in. I had not turned it on. Someone had pulled up the reading assignment early, and the title floated in the recycled air of room 7 like a headstone nobody had bothered to bury. The Sol Collective, Expansion Overreach Collapse. I set my bag down. I set my cup of tea next to it. I looked at the title for exactly one breath, then turned to face the room. 17 students, 4 species. One of them, a Pelari named Civ, was technically a contained gas organism living inside a pressurized environmental suit. She sat in the back row, which I respected. Another, a Threnish boy called Oran, had 8 eyes and was currently using 6 of them to read ahead in the textbook. The other 2 were watching me with what I had learned to identify as Threnish curiosity, which looked, to any uninformed observer, like mild contempt. I knew all their names. I had memorized them the night before the semester started, the way I memorized everything I needed to get through. "Good morning," I said. A scattered collection of translated greetings came back at me. Civ's suit vented something that my earpiece rendered as a courteous acknowledgement. I accepted it. I pulled up the course schedule on my personal slate. Galactic Conflicts, Unit 4, The Fall of the Sol Collective. I had designed this unit myself, 2 years ago, sitting in my office with a cold cup of tea and a blank document that I had stared at for a long time before I started typing. I had written it the way a surgeon writes a case report, organized, sequential, no extra words. I had not eaten much that week. "Before we begin," said a student in the second row, a Keth named Harvin, who had 4 articulated arms and the academic confidence of someone who had never once been wrong about anything. "I want to note that the assigned reading contains several claims that the Valorian hegemony has formally contested in the last academic cycle." "Noted," I said. The hegemony's own historical commission published a corrected account in. "I know what they published," I said. "I was invited to review it. I declined." Harvin's 4 arms did something complicated. I had learned that in Keth body language, this particular arrangement meant the equivalent of a human pressing their lips together and deciding not to push further. I found it one of the more relatable gestures in the room. I began the lecture. The Sol Collective, I told them, was a loose federation of human-governed planets and stations that had, at its peak, controlled 11 star systems and maintained trading relationships with 6 non-human civilizations. It had formed out of necessity rather than ideology, which meant it was always more practical than it was unified. That practicality was both its greatest strength and, in the end, the thing that made it breakable. The Valorian hegemony had not destroyed humanity the way a hammer destroys a nail. It had done it the way water destroys stone, slowly, using the cracks that were already there. I said this without any particular weight in my voice. I said it the way I said everything in this room, clearly, evenly, with enough distance that the information could reach the students without the static of my own frequency getting in the way. Oran, the Threnish student, raised 3 hands. I pointed at the one in the middle, which was the Threnish equivalent of indicating a formal question rather than an interjection. "Professor Osai," he said, "the text identifies the Sol Collective's internal coalition failures as the primary cause of collapse, but the secondary literature suggests the hegemony's supply chain disruption campaign was already terminal before those failures occurred. Which does the primary record support?" I looked at him. He was a good student. He had done the reading. He had also done the supplementary reading that I had not technically assigned but had included in the footnotes, which in my experience sorted students into 2 categories faster than any examination. "Both can be true," I said. "A house with a cracked foundation falls faster when someone pushes it. That does not mean the crack was not the beginning." He wrote something down. I continued. The timeline of the collapse was, from a purely structural standpoint, a useful case study in what happened when a civilization tried to fight a coordinated adversary using a committee. The Sol Collective's governing council had required a two-thirds majority for any military authorization above a certain threshold. This had been designed, sensibly, to prevent any single faction from pulling the whole Federation into a conflict it had not agreed to. What it had also done was make rapid response nearly impossible. By the time the Council reached two-thirds agreement on anything, the situation it was responding to had already changed. I had written a paper on this once early in my career. I had called it a structural tragedy rather than a failure of will. My editor had asked me to soften that phrasing. I had not. Professor Osai, this was Dara, a Dorish student, quiet, meticulous, always in the back left corner. She had dark gray plating that shifted slightly in color when she was processing something. Right now the edges were a pale silver, which I had learned to read as focused attention. You cited the Resistance Archive in your annotations. Page 312. The official hegemony record lists the Resistance Archive as having been destroyed in the consolidation period. I picked up my tea. I did not drink it, I held it. That is an accurate observation, I said. So either the official record is wrong, Dara said, in the careful voice of someone laying a tile rather than throwing it, or your annotation is citing a source that does not exist. Also an accurate observation. Which is it? The room had gone quiet in a way that room 7 did not usually go quiet. Even Siv's suit, which maintained a faint background hum at all times, seemed to have reduced its output. I set the cup down. I turned to the board. At the top, I wrote a date. The date of the Kepler station surrender. Official end of Sol Collective resistance operations. The date that appeared in the hegemony record, in my textbook, in 17 different academic papers published across 6 species academic institutions. Below it, I wrote a second date. I did not explain either of them. What does the syllabus say for next week? I asked. Harvin checked his slate. Primary source analysis, source listed as TBD. Right then, I said. I pulled up the next section of the lecture, the formal surrender, the terms, the categorization of surviving human populations under hegemony administrative code. A student near the window, a young Dorish named Fell who sat next to Dara and rarely spoke, but always submitted the best written work in the class, pulled the official summary onto his personal display, and read the final line aloud without being asked to. The Sol Collective ceased viable resistance operations on Cycle 7.7 of the consolidation era. Humanity is categorized, residual non-threat. The words floated in the room. I was already writing on the board. I did not stop writing. I did not turn around. My handwriting on the holographic surface was neat and consistent, the way I had trained it to be after years of standing in front of rooms like this one. The term residual, I said, still writing, appears 14 times in the hegemony's post-consolidation administrative code. It is applied to biological populations, dormant mineral deposits, and decommissioned relay stations. I capped the marker. Note the company, I said. I turned back to the class. 17 faces, or the species-appropriate equivalent of faces, were looking at me with varying degrees of something that I did not have the energy to categorize. I picked up my tea. This time I drank it. We will continue, I said, with the structural analysis of the coalition failures in the third phase. Please have chapters 9 and 10 annotated for Thursday, and I want your preliminary thoughts, no more than 2 paragraphs, on why the hegemony's historical account begins with the expansion period rather than the first contact record. Orun raised a hand, because beginning with first contact would require acknowledging what humanity looked like before they were a threat. That is one interpretation, I said. Write it down, support it. He was already writing. I moved to the next section. The two dates sat on the board behind me for the rest of the class. No one asked about the second one again. But I noticed, in the last 10 minutes of the session, that 3 students had taken images of the board with their personal devices. Dara had not. She had written both dates down by hand. In the careful notation, she used for things she considered primary data rather than supplementary context. I noticed that too. When the session ended and the room emptied, I stood at the board for a moment. I looked at both dates. I did not erase either of them. I picked up my bag. My cup was empty. I left them there. I had given the same lecture 3 times before. Not to alien students, not in a room with recycled atmospheric blends and a gas student in the back row, but the content had been the same. The timeline, the coalition failures, the structural tragedy of a civilization that had required 2/3 agreement to save itself. The first time I gave it, I was at a small human academic institution on a station that no longer existed under that name. The students had been 18, 19 years old, human. They had asked questions about strategy, about whether different choices could have changed the outcome. I had told them the same thing I told everyone. The structure was the problem. Individual choices operate inside structures. You cannot outrun the architecture. After that lecture, a student had come to my office and asked if I thought it was possible to rebuild something after a total collapse. I had told her it depended on what you meant by rebuild. She had not been satisfied with that answer. I had not been satisfied with it either, but it was the only honest one I had. I thought about her sometimes. I did not know where she was now. The station had been administratively reassigned under hegemony code in the second consolidation period. The records were incomplete, which was a phrase that appeared a great deal in hegemony documentation and meant several different things depending on the context. In this context, I was reasonably certain it meant the records had been made incomplete on purpose. I arrived at my office and put the kettle on. The office was small, which I preferred. A desk, 2 chairs for students, shelves that covered 3 walls from floor to ceiling. The books on those shelves were a mix of physical copies and archived text slates. Anyone who looked closely enough would notice that roughly 1/3 of them were listed as out of circulation in the Collegium's central library system. I had not mentioned this to the library administration. I sat down and opened my grading slate. I had 32 preliminary response papers from the previous unit waiting. I had been putting them off. I began with Dara's because she always submitted first and because reading her work had a particular quality, like watching someone build a bridge out of materials they had found rather than been given. Her paper on the hegemony's containment policy during the second consolidation phase was 3 paragraphs. Each one was a single, clean argument. No decoration, no hedging, just the weight of the evidence arranged in the most efficient possible structure. At the bottom, she had added a note that was not part of the assignment. The citation on page 312 of your annotated text references an event that is dated 14 months after the archive's listed destruction. This is either an error or a data point. I am assuming it is a data point. I read that line twice. I wrote in the margin, correct assumption, no further comment at this time. I moved on to Harvin's paper, which was longer, more confident, and technically sound in a way that stopped just short of interesting. I gave him a high grade with a note that said, strong methodology, limited risk. He would either understand what that meant or he would not. I had found that students who understood it usually came back to ask me about it during office hours. The ones who did not understand it got the grade they had earned and moved on. Fell's paper was 3 lines, not 3 paragraphs, 3 lines. Each one was a question posed as a statement, which was a rhetorical structure I had not taught in this unit, and which suggested he had been reading outside the assigned material. The questions were good. They were the kind of questions that, if answered honestly, would unravel about 40% of the hegemony's official historical account. I gave him full marks and wrote, "Stop asking questions you already know the answers to. It wastes both our time." The next morning I walked into room 7, and the board still had both dates on it from the previous session. The automated cleaning system had not touched the holographic surface, which meant someone had flagged it as active content. I had not flagged it. I looked at it for a moment, then left it exactly as it was and began setting up for the day's session. Today's topic was the Kepler Station surrender, the formal end. I had been at Kepler Station. I had been 26 years old, working as a junior archivist attached to the Sol Collective's Cultural Preservation Division, which was a small department that the military side of the government had always considered a non-essential function. I had spent the 3 months before the surrender cataloging documents, recordings, material artifacts, anything that could be compressed and transmitted or physically transported to secure locations. I did not tell students this. I did not tell anyone this as a general policy. It was not relevant to the lecture. It was not something that could be usefully incorporated into a syllabus without crossing the line between education and something that I did not have a clean word for. I was not interested in being a symbol. I was interested in being a professor. The class filtered in. Dara arrived first, as always. She sat down, opened her notebook, and wrote the date at the top of the page without looking up. Oran arrived second, arranged himself in his chair with the particular efficiency of someone with 8 limbs who had learned to fold himself into furniture designed for 4, and immediately opened the textbook to chapter 10. Siv drifted in last, her suit humming, and settled into the back row. I began. Kepler Station, I told them, was not the largest human installation in the Sol Collective. It was not the most strategically significant, by the metrics the hegemony used for such things. What it was central, not geographically but symbolically. It was the station where the original Sol Collective charter had been signed. It was the place where, 30 years before the collapse, 12 different human factions had agreed on something for the first time in recorded history. It was the obvious place to end things, from the hegemony's point of view. Symbolism is efficient. A surrender at Kepler Station meant the same gesture that had assembled humanity was the one that formally disassembled it. Did the Sol Collective Council understand this? Fell asked. He had not raised his hand. He rarely did. They understood it completely, I said. They signed the agreement there anyway. Why? I paused for exactly 1 second. Because it was already lost, I said. Choosing the location was the only thing they still controlled. They made the choice that would be remembered rather than the one that would be forgotten. Fell wrote that down. I continued. The terms of the surrender were, by the standards of galactic conquest, not brutal. The hegemony was not interested in punishment. Punishment required ongoing attention, and the hegemony had 17 other administrative priorities in that cycle. What they wanted was compliance, resource access, and the cessation of organized resistance. The terms delivered all 3. Human populations retained limited self-governance within designated zones. Cultural practices were permitted within hegemony content guidelines. Educational institutions were allowed to continue operating under hegemony curriculum oversight. That last one always got a reaction, in every version of this class I had ever taught. Harvin's arms shifted into the configuration I had come to recognize as genuine agitation rather than academic performance. They were allowed to continue operating, but under hegemony curriculum oversight. So everything being taught in human institutions after the consolidation was approved, I said. That is not education, that is. Also accurate, I said. The Collegium's own curriculum is reviewed by the Hegemony Academic Standards Board, Dara said, very quietly from the back left corner. Silence. Yes, I said. This class, Dara said, is reviewed by that board. Yes. And you teach it anyway. I picked up my tea. I did not drink it. I held it with both hands, which was something I only did when I needed the warmth rather than the caffeine. I teach what is in the approved syllabus, I said. Chapter 9, Coalition Failures. Chapter 10, Surrender Terms. Chapter 11, Post-Consolidation Administrative Restructuring. And page 312, Dara said. I set the cup down. I turned to the board. Both dates were still there from the previous session. I wrote nothing new beneath them. I simply stood there for a moment looking at them, and then I turned back to the class. Kepler Station, I said, smelled like burnt insulation and recycled oxygen, and something that I have never been able to identify and have stopped trying to. The room went very still. The documentation division was in sub-level 4, I said. There were 17 of us. We had been working in shifts for 91 days. We had processed, by the end, roughly 40% of what we had been assigned to preserve. I said this in the same voice I said everything, clearly, evenly. The other 60%, I said, we had already moved. I did not explain where. I turned back to my lecture notes. Chapter 11, I said, Post-Consolidation Administrative Restructuring. Please have the primary questions prepared for Thursday. Oren's hand was up. I pointed to the middle one. The second date on the board, he said. Is it the date of something that already happened or something that is going to happen? I looked at the board. Thursday, I said, Chapter 11. He wrote something down. I could not see what it was from where I was standing, but I noticed that Dara leaned slightly to read it, and then her plating shifted to a color I had not seen from her before. I did not ask what color it was called. I already knew. Archivist Thesson arrived 12 minutes early. I had expected this. He was the kind of scholar who arrived early everywhere, not out of anxiety, but out of the genuine belief that punctuality was a form of respect, which I found, in his case, entirely sincere and therefore impossible to be irritated by. He came through the door of room 7 with his display materials already organized, gave me the four-handed greeting that was the Valorian academic equivalent of a handshake, and immediately began complimenting the room's atmospheric calibration. You requested the oxygen blend adjustment, he said, for the Dorish students. Their respiratory efficiency drops about 12% in standard collegium air, I said. It affects reading retention. He looked at me the way he often did, with something that sat between admiration and the particular fondness of someone who had known me long enough to understand that my care for my students and my wariness of his civilization's government existed in me without contradiction. Thesson was a good scholar. He was also a Valorian, which meant he had grown up inside the architecture of a civilization that had, from his perspective, brought order to a region of space that had previously been chaotic. He had not built that architecture. He maintained it, academically, with genuine care, the way a historian maintains the record of something they believe in. I did not hold this against him personally. He set up his display at the front of the room. I moved to the back row, to the seat normally occupied by Siv, who had shifted 3 seats to the left to accommodate me with a courtesy that I appreciated. The class arrived. I watched them register the change, the unfamiliar figure at the front, the fact that I was sitting among them. Dara looked at me for precisely 2 seconds, then looked at Thesson, then opened her notebook. Fell did not look at me at all. He looked at Thesson's display materials and then at the board, where both dates were still visible, and then he sat down and folded his hands on the desk in the posture of someone preparing to pay close attention. Thesson was a gifted speaker. I had heard him present before, at 3 different conferences, and each time I had been reminded that the frustrating thing about the hegemony's historical account was not that it was entirely fabricated. It was that it was well constructed. It used real data. It cited genuine sources. It was built with care and intelligence and the kind of institutional confidence that came from never having had to defend its foundations. He opened with the first contact period, which the hegemony's account framed as a careful diplomatic approach to a volatile new species. He presented the timeline of the expansion conflict with clean holographics, color-coded by phase. He used the word pacification in the first 10 minutes, and then again, and then a third time, each usage as natural and unremarkable as breathing. I watched the class. Oran was engaged. His 8 eyes tracked the display with genuine interest, the way he tracked anything new. Harvin's arms were in the configuration of someone who had several points to make and was disciplining himself to wait. The younger Dorish students were taking notes efficiently. Dara was writing nothing. She was watching Thesson. Fel was watching me. I looked at the ceiling. Thesson reached the consolidation period. He presented the hegemony's resource integration policies as stabilizing measures, which from an economic standpoint, taken without context, they functionally were. He presented the Sol collective's governing failures as inevitable outcomes of a structural design that prioritized internal consensus over effective response. He was not wrong about this. I had said the same thing in my own lectures. He was, however, presenting the conclusion without the context that changed what the conclusion meant. He closed with a summary slide. The Sol collective, he said, while demonstrating remarkable adaptive capacity and a genuine cultural richness that the hegemony's preservation programs have worked to maintain, ultimately demonstrated the ceiling of uncoordinated sapient development. As a case study in civilizational limitation, it remains one of the most thoroughly documented examples in the modern record. He smiled at the class. It was a genuine smile. He meant every word. Polite sounds of acknowledgement from the students. Harvin's arms were doing something enthusiastic. I stood up. Thesson looked at me with the warm expression of someone who considered me a colleague and a friend, and who was about to have a mildly interesting academic exchange. Thank you, Archivist Thesson, I said. One question. Of course, he said. Did you read the last page? He blinked his secondary membranes. I consulted the full report in preparation for today. The final chapter covers post-consolidation population management and the administrative integration of Sol origin communities into. Not the chapter, I said. The page, the last one. He looked at me with the careful attention of someone who had just noticed that the conversation had shifted into territory he had not prepared for. The Resistance Archive Appendix, I said. Page 312 of the standard annotated edition of this textbook, I held up a copy, references a source document from the archive. The archive was listed as destroyed in the consolidation record. You were on the Hegemony Historical Commission that certified that record. The room was completely silent. Thesson said slowly, the archive's destruction was confirmed by 3 independent assessments. I said, the document you're referencing in your annotation would therefore have to predate the destruction, or I said. He looked at me. I looked at him. Yara, he said, very quietly, in a register that was not the public register of an archivist addressing a colleague. It was the register of someone who had just understood something and was not sure what to do with it. What does the syllabus say for next week? I said, raising my voice back to classroom level. Harvin checked his slate. Primary source analysis, source TBD. Right then, I said. I returned to Siv's vacated seat. I picked up my tea from the small ledge beside it, the cup I had carried in with me, and I drank it. Thesson stood at the front of the room for a moment. Then he cleared his display materials with the efficiency of someone who had decided to process what had just happened somewhere private. Before he left, he stopped beside my seat. "You could have raised this through official channels," he said, low enough that only I could hear. "I could have," I agreed. He left. Dara looked up from her notebook. She had written one thing on the page during the entire lecture. I could see it from where I was sitting. It said, "What is on the last page?" Not a question, a statement of intent. I finished my tea. "Thursday," I said to the room. "Primary source analysis be here." I released the document at exactly the time the Thursday session was scheduled to begin. No introduction, no framing. I walked in, connected my personal archive to the room's display system, and opened the file. It loaded slowly because it was large, and because some of the embedded material required format conversion from storage protocols that were no longer in standard use. While it loaded, I set up my cup, sat on the edge of my desk rather than standing behind it, and looked at the class. They were all there, every single one of them. Siv had arrived first, which she had never done before. Fel was in his usual seat but had moved his notebook to the center of his desk rather than the corner, which for him was the equivalent of sitting forward. The document finished loading. At the top of the display, where a title would normally appear, there was a classification string, not the Collegium system, a different one, older. Then the content began. There was no dramatic opening. The first page was a table of contents, 43 sections. The heading at the top of the table read, "Sol Collective Continuity Archive, Internal Designation, Ongoing, External Designation, Destroyed, compiled by the Cultural Preservation Division." Harvin's arms went completely still. "This is," he started, then stopped. He read the heading again. "Professor, this is dated 14 months after the official surrender." "Yes," I said. The Sol Collective had officially ceased to exist by this date. "Officially," I said. I let them read. The table of contents was, in its way, the most striking part, not because of what it contained, but because of what the fact of its existence meant. 43 sections, organized with the calm precision of people who had decided, collectively, that the work of preservation did not end because an administrative document said it did. Section 1. Agricultural Adaptation Records from 14 Human-Occupied Worlds in the First Post-Consolidation Year. Not resistance documents, farming records. What grew in soil that had been disrupted by resource extraction? What did not grow? What people had figured out in the gap between what did not grow and not eating? Section 7. Educational Network Documentation. Under hegemony curriculum oversight, human children in administrative zones were being taught a specific version of history, culture, and science. Section 7 documented a parallel network that operated through community gathering spaces, trade routes, and personal correspondence. It had reached, by the time of the most recent entry in this file, the children of 73 different communities across 9 systems. It had been doing this for 31 years. Section 12. Cultural Transmission Records. Music specifically. I had written Section 12 myself in the early years before my responsibilities shifted. A composition movement had developed in the 3rd year after the surrender, not as protest, but as practice. People playing music they had written, sharing it with other people who shared it further. It had spread through hegemony-controlled trade signal frequencies, embedded in standard commercial data packets, invisible because it was not encrypted and not coded and not trying to hide. It was just music that people wanted to share. By the time anyone in the hegemony's administrative structure thought to look at it, it was in 17 systems. Oren had stopped taking notes. He was reading, all 8 eyes completely absorbed. Section 28 was the one that made Dara's plating shift to the pale silver of maximum focus and stay there. Section 28 was the archive itself, not a description of it, not a summary. The actual index of the Resistance Archive, which was not and had never been a single location that could be destroyed. It was a distributed network of storage nodes spread across 3 proxy civilizations that had, at various points in the preceding decades, owed the Sol collective favors of one kind or another. None of those 3 civilizations had known about the others. The Hegemonies Commission had found and destroyed a collection of files on a single station and declared the archive gone. They had found the node that had been placed, with some care, in the most obvious location. The less obvious ones had kept running. "This is active," said Harvin, and his voice had lost the particular quality of academic performance. It was the voice of someone genuinely recalibrating. "Professor, this is present tense. The dates in section 28 go up to," he checked. He checked again. "This was updated 11 days ago." "Yes," I said. "The archive that was officially destroyed." "Officially," I said again. "How long," Fell said, not looking up from the display, "has this been running?" "The Cultural Preservation Division was established 7 years before the surrender," I said. "The continuity protocols were written in the 3rd year of the division's operation. The division head at the time was a woman named Gloria Adami, who had a background in library science and an extremely practical view of worst-case planning." I paused. "She was very good at her job," I said. Dara looked up. "You worked in the Cultural Preservation Division." "Junior archivist," I said. "I was very junior." "Page 312 of the annotated text," Dara said. "The citation you used, the source document from the archive, that was something you preserved." "Among other things." "The 60%, Fell said very quietly. He had remembered clearly what I had said 2 sessions ago. The 40% processed. The other 60 already moved. At Kepler Station. The 60% you had moved before the surrender." I did not answer. I did not need to. Siv's suit vented something. My earpiece translated it, after a longer pause than usual, as, "I did not understand what I was sitting in the back row of." "You were sitting in a history class," I said. "I was sitting in an ongoing event," she said. The room sat with that. Oren lowered his notebook. He had been writing constantly for the past 40 minutes and now he stopped. "Professor Osai, the second date on the board, it has been there since the first session." He turned to look at it. "It is not a historical date." "No," I said. "It is 3 weeks from today." "Yes." "What happens in 3 weeks?" I reached for my tea. I had not brought a cup today, I realized. I had set up everything else and forgotten the cup. I looked at the empty space on my desk where it should have been. "I assigned you a final paper," I said. "Write the epilogue the Valorian record did not." "That is not an answer," Harvin said, and for once his voice had no performance in it at all. "It is the assignment," I said. Dara closed her notebook. She placed her hand flat on the cover. A doorish gesture I had learned early in the semester meant a decision made rather than a question asked. "The Hegemonies record categorized humanity as residual non-threat," she said. "You built a curriculum around that categorization. You have been teaching it for 2 years. You designed the unit yourself." "Yes." "You taught us the defeat." "Yes." "And then you gave us the archive that was inside the defeat the whole time." I looked at her. She looked back at me with those pale silver plate edges and the steady attention of someone who had been building toward this conclusion. Since the first day, she had seen a citation that did not match a destroyed source. "The paper is due in 3 weeks," I said. "I expect primary source citations. I expect original arguments. I expect you to write as though the reader does not already know how the story ends, because, in my experience, most readers stop before the last page." I stood up. The display was still showing the archive. 43 sections, 31 years of ongoing work, music in 17 systems, Children in 73 communities learning things they were not officially supposed to know. Farms growing things in soil that had been told it could not grow them. Office hours are tomorrow from 10 to noon, I said. I will see those of you who have questions. I picked up my bag. I left the archive open on the display. 3 weeks passed the way the last weeks of a semester always pass, which is to say both faster and slower than any other 3-week period in the year. Faster because there was too much to do. Slower because every day had the particular weight of days that are the last of something. I graded. I held office hours. I answered questions, the ones I could answer, and redirected the ones I could not. Dara came to office hours twice. The first time, she asked me a series of precise questions about the archive's organizational structure that told me she had read all 43 sections and was now trying to understand the logic behind how they had been compiled. I answered what I could. The second time, she did not ask questions. She sat down across from me and said, "I have submitted my paper." "I know," I said. "I received it this morning. I cited you as a primary source." "I noticed. Is that methodologically sound?" I looked at her for a moment. A source is sound if it is accurate and if the person citing it can defend the citation. Can you defend it? "Yes," she said. "Then it is sound," I said. Fell never came to office hours. He submitted his paper a full week early. It was 4 pages, which was double the minimum and half what most students had written, and it was, without any contest, the finest piece of student work I had received in 11 years of teaching. He had written the epilogue not as a historical summary, but as a document from inside the continuity archive itself, a section that did not yet exist, covering events he had extrapolated from the patterns he had identified in the existing sections. His extrapolations were, in several specifics, accurate. I gave him full marks and wrote, "I hope you understand what you have just demonstrated. I think you do." Oren submitted on time, with 17 footnotes and a bibliography that suggested he had, in the 3 weeks since the archive was released, read approximately 4 times more than the assignment required. His argument was the most structurally complex in the class, and also the one that engaged most directly with the hegemony's official account, not to refute it wholesale, but to identify the precise points at which its evidence was genuine and its conclusions were not. It was good work. It was the work of someone who had understood that the most durable challenge to a flawed record was not to call it a lie, but to demonstrate carefully where the evidence stopped supporting the conclusion. I wrote, "This is how you do it, remember that." Harvin's paper was long, thorough, and showed genuine struggle, which was new. He had never struggled with an assignment before, not visibly. The struggle showed in places where his argument reached and then pulled back, where he had clearly written something and then reconsidered it and replaced it with something more careful. I could see, in the structure of the writing, the shape of the thing he had almost said. I gave him a strong grade and wrote, "Write the version you pulled back from, not for submission, for yourself. You need to know what you actually think." On the last morning, I arrived at room 7 early. The board had both dates on it still, after a full semester. The automated system had learned by now to leave it alone. I stood in front of them and looked at them for a longer time than I usually allowed myself. The first date was the end of the Saul Collective. The second date was today. I had known, when I wrote it in that first session, what today was. I had chosen this date for reasons that were practical rather than dramatic, but there is a way in which practical reasons and meaningful ones are sometimes the same thing. The students arrived, all of them. Siv was first again. I waited until they were settled. "I want to return your papers in a moment," I said, "but first I want to tell you something that is not in any of the readings." The room went quiet with attention rather than absence. "The Cultural Preservation Division," I said, "was not a prestigious assignment. When I was offered the position, A colleague told me, kindly, that it was the kind of role that people took when they had not managed to get the more competitive appointments. He was not wrong about the prestige. He was wrong about what it was. I looked at the shelves in my mind, the ones in my office, the archived slates, the books listed as out of circulation. Gloria Adami, who designed the continuity protocols, used to say that the most important archive is the one nobody knows about. Not because secrecy is noble, because the things that get preserved are the things that someone decided were worth the effort of preserving. The decision is the act. The archive is the evidence of the decision. I paused. You have spent this semester reading the record of a defeat. You have also spent this semester in the same room as the archive that was built inside that defeat. Those two things are not contradictions. They are the complete picture. I started handing back the papers. I am leaving the collegium at the end of this term, I said, as I moved between the rows. I have accepted a position elsewhere. The details are not relevant to this course. Fell took his paper without looking at the grade. He read my note. He read it again. The second date, Oren said, holding his paper. Today, what happens today? I reached the front of the room. I had one paper left, which was my own. Not a paper exactly. A document I had printed and placed in the stack this morning. A single page with a date at the top, a short paragraph, and a signature at the bottom. I set it on the front desk, rather than handing it to anyone. The Resistance Archive, I said, has operated for 31 years on the principle that preservation is ongoing rather than completed. The current coordinating archivist has been in this role for 9 years. She has decided to move into a different capacity. I looked at the paper on the desk. The position of coordinating archivist is not appointed. It is assumed. The assumption is documented. Dara stood up. I do not know if she had known exactly. I think she had known the shape of it without the specific details, the way she knew most things, by building toward a conclusion from evidence rather than being told. She walked to the front of the room. She picked up the paper. She read it. She set it back down and looked at me. This is the last page, she said. Yes, I said. She looked at the paper again. The date at the top was today's date. The paragraph below it was brief and formal and said, in the language of archival transfer documentation, that responsibility for the ongoing coordination of the Saul Collective Continuity Archive was being transferred from one custodian to another. The signature line at the bottom had my name on it. The line above it, for the incoming custodian, was blank. I am not human, Dara said. Gloria Adami's first deputy archivist was a Dorish national, I said. She chose her because she was the best person for the work. The archive was always about the work. Dara was quiet for a long moment. Her plating along the edges had shifted to a color I had not seen before, not the pale silver of focused attention, something warmer. I did not have a word for it in any of the 4 languages I spoke. I do not know enough yet, she said. Nobody does when they start, I said. She picked up the document. She held it carefully, with the particular attention she gave to things she had decided were primary data. The archive needs someone who understands what is in it, I said, and who will not stop reading at the official last page. I put on my coat, which I had brought with me this morning, and set on the chair beside my desk instead of hanging it up. You read page 312 and came to office hours to ask about it. Everyone else wrote it in their notes and moved on. Fell made a sound that was not quite a word. He had his paper in his hands and was looking at it with the expression of someone watching 2 pieces of information connect. You knew, he said to me, not accusingly, just a statement of sequence. You knew when you designed the curriculum, when you wrote Earth's defeat into the lesson plan. You knew you were going to hand this off. I knew I was going to retire from this classroom, I said. I did not know who I was going to find. I designed a class that would select for the person I needed. I looked at the room. all 17 of them, Siv in the back row with her suit humming quietly, Oren with his notebook and his 8 attentive eyes, Harvin with his arms in a configuration I had not seen before and could not read. I found several people I was glad to have found, and one that the archive needed. I picked up my bag. I looked at the board, both dates, the end of the Sol Collective, today. The hegemony called us residual non-threat, I said. They were measuring the right thing and misreading the data. We were residual. We are extremely, thoroughly, persistently residual. I looked at Dara, who was standing at the front of the room holding a document that was 31 years old in spirit and 1 morning old in the making. And we have never, in my experience, stopped being a threat to the version of history that does not include us. I walked to the door. Your final grades will be posted by end of week, I said. Office hours are canceled as I will no longer have an office. If you have questions about the archive, Dara has the documentation. I opened the door. The supplementary reading for personal development, I said without turning back, is everything in section 36 of the archive. It is the section I wrote. I believe it is the best work I have ever done, and I believe most of you are capable of building something better. I expect you to do exactly that. I walked out. The corridor outside room 7 was the same corridor it had always been. The same recycled air, and the low hum of the building's atmospheric systems, and the distant sound of other classes in session somewhere further along. I did not look back. I had been carrying the archive for a long time. My hands, walking down that corridor toward the door, felt like my own for the first time in years. Behind me, through the closed door of room 7, I heard the specific sound of a room full of students who were not leaving, who were staying, who had something to do. I had been a junior archivist once, 26 years old, standing in a sub-level corridor on Kepler Station with a list of things that needed to be preserved, and the practical, quiet certainty of someone who had understood very early that the work did not stop because the official record said it did. Gloria Adami had handed me a document with a blank signature line and said, "The archive needs someone who will not stop at the last page." I had signed it without asking what came next. I walked out of the collegium into the open air of the station's exterior level, where the artificial sky ran its slow cycle through the color of late afternoon, and I stood there for a moment with my bag on my shoulder and no cup of tea in my hand, and nothing left to hand over. The defeat was in the record. The record had a last page now. I had not written it. That was the point.